last report is about the concepts related to plant growth. And we have here is the Liebig's law of minimum. This law is otherwise known as the barrel concept. If a barrel has staves of different heights, the lowest one sets the capacity of the barrel. I'll show you some videos of Liebig's law of minimum to understand more about the barrel concept.
They often focus on the most limiting factor impacting their yield. And for most producers, specifically corn production in the Midwest, that most limiting factor is so often nitrogen. However, focusing all of your fertilizer investment dollars only on nitrogen could be a bad idea for the profitability of your operation. Most people only focus on nitrogen fertilization, specifically for non-leguminous crops like corn, because they're considering the concept of Liebig's law of the minimum. Liebig's law tells us that the yield achievable is dictated by the availability of the most limiting nutrient, but is so often misunderstood. To illustrate this concept, we're going to use the visual of a dam. The achievable yield within your operation is equivalent to the amount of water that this dam is able to hold back. The individual squares at the bottom of the dam, those represent nutrient-based yield limiting factors. Because nitrogen is the biggest hole, most producers think that's the only hole they have to plug to maximize production, and that is not necessarily true. This misperception and focusing only on a single nutrient can actually cost you money. More than likely, there are other yield limiting factors, let's just say potassium and phosphorus. So even if you plug the nitrogen hole, if either of those two nutrients are not supplied to 100% sufficiency, you're still missing out on yields and money. Now there's more to it. Let's go back to the beginning. The other misperception about Liebig's law is that your yield is only impacted by the nutrient that is most limiting production. However, let's say I ignore my nitrogen hole completely. It's still my most limiting factor. But if I plug my potassium hole to 100% sufficiency, I still increase the achievable yield that I can make on a given field. You may be operating under the assumption that each of these individual holes operate independently of one another. However, the nature of the interaction between potassium and nitrogen is such that if I don't have adequate potassium, it can actually require more nitrogen to be supplied. In this graph, the red line represents corn response to nitrogen when potassium is not supplied to 100% sufficiency. Note when potassium is not supplied to sufficiency, the corn yield does not quite reach a maximum. The green line represents a scenario where adequate potassium has been supplied. Notice how the green line reaches a maximum yield and achieves that yield at a lower rate of nitrogen. And again, this leads to higher efficiency of fertilizer use and higher yields and higher profitability. Bottom line, as we think about crop fertilization and specifically the concept of Liebig's law, if you want to get the most out of your nitrogen fertilizer dollar, ensure that your soil has an adequate level of potassium.
So the Liebig's law of minimum states that growth is dictated not by the total resources available, but by the scarcest resource. The second one is Blackman's theory of optima and limiting factors. When a process is conditioned as to its rapidity by a number of separate factors, the rate of the process is limited by the slowest factor. I'll show you some videos of Blackman's theory of optima and limiting factors to understand more about this theory.
Hello students, let's today revise about law of limiting factor. It was proposed by F. Blackman in the year 1905. In photosynthesis, light, carbon dioxide concentration and temperature are very important for the rate of photosynthesis. As per law of limiting factor, at a given time, rate of photosynthesis depends on factor which is the lowest. For example, if optimum light and carbon dioxide is available and temperature is very low, then rate of photosynthesis will be controlled by temperature. Increase in the temperature, there will be increase in the rate of photosynthesis, and then there will be a steady state. So now there's optimum light and optimum temperature and less carbon dioxide. Further, increase in the rate of photosynthesis is possible only if there is increase in carbon dioxide concentration. So as the carbon dioxide concentration increase, there will be increase in the rate of photosynthesis. But again, there will be a steady state. And further increase is only possible if availability or intensity of light increases. Thus, at a time, only one factor controls the rate and is called limiting factor. This law of limiting factor is applicable to any biochemical reaction. It states that if a chemical biochemical process is affected by more than one factor, then the rate will be determined by the factor which is nearest to its minimum value. It is the factor which directly affects the rate if its quantity is changed.
The third one is Mitscherlich law of diminishing return. When plants had adequate amounts of all but one limiting element, the growth response was proportional to the limitation element. So, Mitscherlich's law of diminishing return can be considered as a law of decreasing raw material exploitation which emerges from the law of the minimum associated with random limiting points of the production units.